The Katyusha rockets had stopped screaming 2 hours ago. That's what terrified Private Dmitry Volkov the most. Not the explosions that had torn the earth apart, but the terrible silence that followed. He pressed his back against the shattered brick wall of what had once been a farmhouse, somewhere in the blood-soaked fields outside Kursk. July 1943. The air still shimmered with heat and smoke. His breath came in ragged gasps. Despite 3 years of combat hardening his lungs, blood had dried in a thick crust along his cheek, mixing with the black earth and ash that covered every Soviet soldier in this cursed salient. His Mosin Nagant rifle lay buried somewhere in the crater 50 meters back, the wooden stock splintered, the bolt mechanism jammed with dirt and flesh. The German artillery barrage had caught his platoon in the open during a counterattack. 32 men had charged across that field. Dmitry didn't know how many had made it back. He knew he hadn't. With trembling fingers, Dmitry checked what remained on his belt. The inventory was brutally simple. One NR-40 combat knife, its 6-inch blade still sharp, the leather grip worn smooth from countless nights of nervous handling in the trenches. One RGD-33 stick grenade, its wooden handle scarred but solid, the serrated fragmentation sleeve still intact despite being blown clear across a wheat field. That was all. No rifle, no ammunition. His canvas pack with its precious rations of black bread and tobacco had been torn away. The radio operator who'd been running beside him had simply ceased to exist in a flash of orange fire. No way to call for help. No way home. The steppe stretched before him. A nightmare landscape of burned grain, abandoned equipment, and bodies that would never be recovered. Somewhere beyond the smoke, his regiment was either destroyed or retreating. The commissar had called it regrouping for a renewed assault. The veterans had known better, reading the truth in their officers' eyes as they fell back under the relentless German counteroffensive. Dmitry was supposed to retreat with them. But when the shells began falling, like the wrath of God himself, when the world dissolved into screaming metal and fountaining earth, all sense of direction had vanished. He'd crawled the wrong way deeper into German-held territory, instead of back to Soviet lines. Now, as the summer sun began its descent, painting the smoke-filled sky, the color of dried blood, he heard them approaching. Voices, sharp, Germanic, calling to each other with military precision as they swept through the ruins, hunting for wounded Soviets to interrogate or finish. The Wehrmacht patrol moved with the confidence of men who'd been winning for 2 years, who'd learned to kill efficiently in the frozen hell of Stalingrad and the spring mud of Ukraine. They were thorough. They were experienced. They were coming straight toward him. Every instinct screamed at Dmitry to move, to slip away through the rubble, to crawl through the wheat stubble until he reached Soviet lines. The NKVD blocking detachments might shoot him for retreating, but at least he'd have a chance. His training, such as it was, 3 weeks before being thrown into combat, had emphasized one thing: survive, return to the unit, fight again for the motherland. A lone soldier didn't stand and fight. He survived. He evaded. He lived. But something had shattered inside Dmitry Volkov when those rockets fell. Something that couldn't be put back together with propaganda or threats or promises of glory. He'd watched Sergeant Petrov, a man who'd fought at Moscow, who'd survived the winter of '41, who'd been teaching Dmitry how to stay alive, disappear in a geyser of dirt and bone. He'd heard young Alexei crying for his mother with his legs blown off, knowing no medical orderly would reach him in time. He'd felt a concussion lift him like a child's toy and slam him into the rubble hard enough to crack teeth. And now, crouched in these ruins with nothing but a knife and a grenade, Dmitry Volkov made a decision that would have earned him a hero's medal or a traitor's bullet, depending on who survived to tell the story. He wasn't going to run. The German voices grew clearer, accompanied by the methodical crunch of boots on broken brick. Dmitry counted them by sound 5 soldiers, maybe 6. They moved in a textbook search pattern, weapons ready, checking every shadow. Standard Wehrmacht infantry, probably from one of the Panzer Grenadier divisions that had been chewing through Soviet positions for weeks. They'd find him in less than 2 minutes, his hand wrapped around the stick grenade's wooden handle, pulling it from his belt. He studied the familiar weight, the fuse cord that would give him 4 seconds after he pulled it. 4 seconds between life and whatever came after. The fragmentation sleeve would send steel shrapnel in a deadly radius of 10 meters. In these close quarters, it would be like the hammer of God. The NR-40 knife came next, sliding from its sheath in silence. The blade caught no light in the gathering dusk. Good. Perfect for what had to come next. If there was a next. Dmitri closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment, just one, to think of home. The small wooden house in the Urals. His mother's cabbage soup. His father's rough hands, teaching him to repair tractors. His little sister Katya, who'd been 12 when he left, who'd pressed a small icon of St. George into his palm and made him swear to return. He was going to break that promise, but he would keep another promise, the one every Soviet soldier made when the Germans came. The promise written in blood, across 1,000 kilometers of scorched earth. You will pay for every meter. The first German appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later, backlit by the red sky. Dmitri could see the Mauser rifles sweeping the interior, could hear the soldiers' steady breathing, could smell the distinctive odor of German tobacco and gun oil. The soldier called out something in German, probably ordering any survivors to surrender. He took one step inside the ruined farmhouse, then another, and Dmitri Volkov, a 21-year-old private from a village no one had ever heard of, with nothing but a knife and a grenade, and a heart full of rage and grief and 3 years of accumulated fury, prepared to make his stand. His fingers tightened on the grenade's pull cord. The German soldier never saw it coming. Dmitri's decision was made in the fraction of a heartbeat. Don't use the grenade yet. Not for one man. Save it for when they're all inside, clustered together like sheep in a pen. The knife would have to do the work first. He let the German take 3 steps into the room, let him turn his head to call back to his comrades, let him relax just enough to think the farmhouse was empty. Then Dmitri moved. 3 years of survival had taught him things that training camps never could. How to make his body flow like water. How to strike from darkness like a viper. How to kill a man before he could scream. The NR-40 blade punched upward beneath the German's jaw, driving through soft tissue and tongue, piercing into the brain cavity. Dmitri's free hand clamped over the soldier's mouth, catching the gurgling gasp before it could escape. The Mauser clattered against the man's chest, suspended by its sling. The German's eyes went wide blue eyes, Dmitri noticed. Young eyes, maybe 20 years old. For one horrible moment, they stared at each other, killer and killed. Both boys, who should have been working farms or courting girls instead of dying in the mud of someone else's country. Then the light went out of those blue eyes, and Dmitri lowered the body silently to the floor. Hans? A voice called from outside. Hans, was ist drin? Dmitri's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were slick with blood. The first time he'd killed a man with a knife, up close enough to feel his last breath. Shooting from 100 meters was one thing. This was something else entirely. No time to think. No time for horror, or guilt, or humanity. Only survival. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door. Knife ready. Grenade still on his belt. The stick grenade felt heavy as a millstone now. His one chance. He couldn't waste it. Hans. The voice again, sharper now, concerned. Then rapid German calling for the others, reporting something wrong. Boots crunched on rubble, multiple sets. They were coming. Dmitri's mind raced. The room was maybe 4 meters square, part of the farmhouse kitchen. One door, the one they'd be coming through. One window, half collapsed, on the opposite wall. A heavy wooden table, overturned, broken crockery, the smell of old smoke and death. He had perhaps 5 seconds before they came in shooting. The grenade came off his belt. His fingers found the pull cord. 4 seconds after he pulled it. The fragmentation sleeve would do the rest. but only if they were close enough. Only if he timed it perfectly. Two figures appeared in the doorway simultaneously, rifles up, moving with the practiced coordination of veterans. They saw Hans's body, their weapons swung toward. Dmitri yanked the cord. The fuse ignited with a hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. 4 seconds. He counted automatically, the way Sergeant Petrov had taught him. 1. The Germans saw the grenade in his hand, their eyes widening in recognition of death. 2. They tried to backpedal, shouting warnings, but the doorway became a bottleneck of panicked men. 3. Dmitri hurled the stick grenade with all his strength, not at the doorway but beyond it, where the voices were clustered. 4. The world ended in thunder and screaming. The blast wave slammed Dmitri against the wall hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Dust and smoke filled the room, turning the air into a choking fog. But Dmitri was already moving, diving through the half-collapsed window before the debris stopped falling. Shrapnel had torn through the doorway like an invisible scythe. He didn't look back to see what he'd done. Didn't want to see the torn bodies, the blood, the evidence of what survival had cost. He hit the ground outside and rolled. Came up running, the knife still clutched in his hand. Behind him, the farmhouse had become a tomb. But not all of them were dead. "Dort! Dort!" a voice shouted. "There! There!" A rifle cracked, and brick exploded near Dmitri's head. At least one German had been far enough from the blast to survive. Maybe more. Dmitri zigzagged through the rubble, his legs pumping with desperate strength. The wheat field was 30 meters away, burned stubble that would offer minimal cover, but it was better than standing in the open. Another shot, closer this time. Whoever was shooting knew his business. 20 meters. Dmitri's lungs burned. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. The ringing in his ears made it impossible to tell how many were chasing him. 10 meters. He could hear shouting now, multiple voices. German voices, angry and afraid, and baying for blood like hounds after a fox. He dove into the wheat stubble just as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground where he'd been standing. An MP-40 submachine gun, close range. They were right behind him. Dmitri crawled on his belly like a snake, the knife still gripped in his hand, his only weapon now. The grenade was gone. His final card played. All he had left was 6 inches of steel and the will to use it. The wheat stubble was perhaps 20 centimeters high. Not enough to hide a man, but enough to break up his silhouette in the fading light. Dmitri crawled away from where he'd entered, moving at an angle, trying to confuse their tracking. His elbows and knees scraped raw against the hard earth. Behind him, the Germans had stopped shouting. That was worse. Silence meant they were hunting properly now, scanning methodically, conserving ammunition. How many? 2? 3? The grenade had killed some, wounded others. But the Wehrmacht didn't give up easily. A boot crunched in the stubble, close enough to make Dmitri freeze. He pressed his face into the dirt, holding his breath, every muscle locked. Through slitted eyes he could see the German's legs, gray uniform trousers, boots caked with mud and blood. The soldier was scanning the field, rifle at the ready. The German took another step, then another. He was going to walk right past Dmitri's position, 5 meters to the left. Dmitri made his choice. Let him pass, or take him now. His fingers tightened on the knife handle. The blade was still sticky with the first soldier's blood. Hans, the boy with blue eyes, who would never go home. The German soldier stopped walking. Dmitri's heart froze. Had he been spotted? "Higher, Druben!" The soldier called out. "Over here!" He'd seen something, a disturbance in the stubble, a dark shape that might be a man. He turned toward Dmitri's position and raised his rifle. Dmitri exploded from the wheat stubble like a demon from hell itself. The German had perhaps half a second to register the shape hurtling toward him before Dmitri crashed into him with the force of absolute desperation. They went down together, the rifle discharging into the air. the crack of the shot impossibly loud. But Dmitri was already inside the soldier's guard, too close for the rifle to matter. The knife came up once, twice, 3 times brutal, efficient strikes to the torso. The German gasped, his hands scrabbling at Dmitri's face, trying to gouge eyes, to find a throat to crush. They rolled in the dirt, 2 men locked in the oldest dance of all, the struggle for survival stripped of all honor and glory. The German was bigger, stronger, better fed, but Dmitri had the knife and the fury of 3 years of watching his friends die. The blade found the gap between the ribs, slid home, twisted. The German's hands stopped clawing. His body went slack. Dmitri pushed the corpse away and staggered to his feet, gasping, covered in blood that wasn't entirely his own. Friedrich. Another voice close by. They'd heard the rifle shot. They were converging. Dmitri grabbed the German's Mauser 98K rifle, checking the bolt automatically. 5 rounds in the magazine. A fighting chance. The dead soldier had 2 more ammunition pouches on his belt, 10 rounds each. Dmitri stripped them with shaking hands. Movement in his peripheral vision. Dmitri threw himself flat as bullets cracked overhead. 2 Germans advancing in textbook fire and maneuver, one shooting while the other moved. Professional. Experienced. Death on 2 legs. Dmitri rolled into a shallow depression, brought the Mauser up, found the rear sight. His target was 80 meters out, moving fast. Dmitri led him by a meter. Exhaled slowly. Squeezed the trigger. The Mauser bucked against his shoulder. The German soldier stumbled, went down, clutching his leg. Not a kill shot, but he was out of the fight. The other German hit the dirt, returning fire. Rounds snapped through the air around Dmitri's position. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. The action was smooth, familiar. He'd fired 10,000 practice rounds with the Mosin Nagant, and the German rifle felt like greeting an old friend. But this wasn't target practice. This was a duel in the dying light, 2 men trying to kill each other before full darkness fell. Dmitri waited, counting heartbeats. The German would have to move eventually. Would have to check on his wounded comrade or try to flank. Patience was a weapon too. 30 seconds, a minute. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the battlefield in shades of crimson and gold. Beautiful. If you could forget the blood and the bodies and the waste of it all. Movement. Just a flicker, but enough. The German was crawling to his right, trying to get an angle. Dmitri adjusted his aim, led the motion, fired. Miss. The bullet kicked up dirt, a hand's width from the target. The German returned fire immediately. 3 quick shots that forced Dmitri to scrunch down into his shallow hole. 4 rounds left in the rifle, 10 more in each pouch. Enough for a firefight, but not enough to be careless. The wounded German was screaming now, calling for help in German. The sound was pitiful, human, breaking through the wall of hate and fear. Dmitri tried not to hear it. Tried not to think of the man as a person, as someone's son, or brother, or father. Just the enemy. Just a target. But the screaming got louder, more desperate. And in that screaming, Dmitri heard his own voice from a dozen battles ago, heard Alexei calling for his mother, heard every wounded man who'd ever bled out in the mud while his comrades fought on. The other German was shouting back to his wounded friend words of encouragement, promises of rescue. The voice cracked with emotion. Brothers, Dmitri realized. They were brothers. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it. 2 brothers, fighting in a war neither of them had chosen. Dying in a field neither of them had ever wanted to see. Just like Dmitri and his sister Katya. Except Katya was safe in the Urals, and these 2 were here in the killing ground. When he opened his eyes, the light had changed. Dusk was settling fast now. In another 10 minutes, it would be dark enough to move without being seen. Dmitri made his decision. He couldn't save them both, but maybe he could end it quickly, without more suffering. A mercy. If mercy had any meaning anymore in this godforsaken war. He adjusted his position slightly, got a better angle on where the unwounded German was sheltering behind a burned-out cart. The range was maybe 60 meters. Difficult in this light, but not impossible. Dimitri's finger tightened on the trigger. The Mauser's front sight blade centered on a patch of gray uniform visible between the cart's wheels. Then something changed. The German stood up. Just stood up, rifle lowered, hands visible. He was shouting something not in German, but in broken Russian. Neat Strelet, don't shoot. Dimitri froze, the rifle still aimed at the man's chest. What kind of trick was this? The German slowly, very slowly, set his rifle on the ground. Then he raised his hands above his head, still speaking in that broken Russian. Moi, brat. Umarayat. My brother. Dying. The wounded man's screaming had stopped. Now it was just quiet sobbing, the sound of someone slipping away. Pos Haloista, the German said. Please. Dimitri's mind reeled. This was insane. They'd been trying to kill each other 30 seconds ago. Now this German was standing in the open, unarmed, begging not for his own life, but for permission to help his dying brother. It was a trick. Had to be. The moment Dimitri lowered his rifle, the German would grab his weapon But the sobbing was getting quieter. Running out of time. Dimitri stood up slowly, keeping the Mauser trained on the German. In the red light of sunset, they looked at each other across the scorched earth. Two soldiers, two survivors, two men who'd killed too many and seen too much. The German's face was young, maybe 25, exhausted, terrified, but not for himself, for the man bleeding out in the wheat stubble. Dimitri jerked his head in a nod. Go. The German's eyes widened in disbelief. Then he moved, dropping to his knees beside his brother, hands already working to apply pressure to the wound, speaking softly in German, the words of comfort men say to the dying. Dimitri kept the rifle trained on them both, finger on the trigger, ready to shoot at the first sign of treachery. But the German never looked up, never reached for his weapon, just held his brother and spoke to him until the sobbing stopped entirely. The silence that followed was heavier than any artillery barrage. The German bowed his head, his shoulders shook with silent crying. After a long moment, he closed his brother's eyes with gentle fingers, then stood slowly, turning to face Dimitri. They stared at each other in the gathering darkness. Neither moved, neither spoke. Then the German bent down, picked up his rifle, and walked away into the smoke. Not running, not looking back, just walking, carrying the weight of one more death that this cursed war had demanded. Dimitri watched him go, the Mauser still ready, but knowing he wouldn't fire, couldn't fire, not now. When the German had disappeared into the smoke, Dimitri lowered his rifle and sank to the ground, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He'd survived. Against impossible odds, with nothing but a knife and a grenade. He'd survived an encounter with an entire enemy patrol. But looking at the bodies scattered across the field, Hans with the blue eyes, Friedrich and his brother, the men torn apart by the grenade, Dimitri wondered if survival was the same as victory. The sun was gone now. Full darkness had fallen. Somewhere to the west he could hear the rumble of artillery starting up again. The war grinding on, indifferent to individual stories of mercy or madness. Dimitri picked himself up, slung the Mauser over his shoulder, and began the long walk back towards Soviet lines. If the NKVD didn't shoot him for retreating, if he didn't step on a mine, if the Germans didn't send another patrol, but for now, in this moment, he was alive. 3 days later, Dmitry Volkov stumbled into Soviet lines, looking more dead than alive. The sentries nearly shot him. He was covered in dried blood, his uniform torn and filthy, carrying a German rifle, every sign of a deserter or saboteur. But he still had his identification papers, still remembered the day's password, and his 1,000-meter stare spoke of things that couldn't be faked. They brought him to the regimental command post, where a weary major listened to his story with the kind of skepticism that came from hearing too many lies from too many soldiers trying to explain why they'd survived when others hadn't. "You're telling me," the major said, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly, "that you single-handedly engaged a German patrol with only a knife and a grenade?" "Yes, Comrade Major." "And killed?" "How many?" "4, Comrade Major. Maybe 5. The grenade," Dimitri's voice caught. He swallowed hard. "I couldn't see clearly after." The major studied him through the smoke. "And then you let one escape?" This was the dangerous part. Dimitri had known it would be. In the Red Army, mercy toward the enemy was often indistinguishable from treason. He was unarmed, Comrade Major. His brother had died. Dimitri stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound like cowardice. It was dark. "I assessed that pursuing him would risk my position." The major's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe this?" "I have a German rifle, Comrade Major. Ammunition pouches, a knife with German blood on it." Dimitri placed them on the table. "And this?" He pulled something from his pocket, a photograph, creased and stained with blood. It showed 2 young men in Wehrmacht uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. Brothers. Dimitri had taken it from Friedrich's body before starting his long walk back. He didn't know why he'd kept it. Maybe as proof. Maybe as penance. The major picked up the photograph, studied it for a long moment. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression. "You're a fool, Volkov," he said quietly. "A sentimental fool. In this war, mercy gets you killed. Yes, Comrade Major, but you're also a survivor. And right now, the motherland needs survivors more than she needs heroes." The major stubbed out his cigarette. "You'll be reassigned to the 23rd Guards Rifle Division. They lost 60% casualties in the last push. They need men who know how to fight." "Yes, Comrade Major." "And Volkov?" The major's voice stopped him at the door. "Don't tell anyone else about letting that German walk away. The commissars won't be as understanding as I am." Dimitri nodded and left, the weight of what he'd done settling onto his shoulders like a lead coat. The war ground on for nearly 2 more years. Dmitri Volkov fought in the push to liberate Ukraine, crossed into Poland, and finally stood in the rubble of Berlin in the spring of 1945. He was promoted to sergeant, awarded the Order of the Red Star for bravery at the Vistula crossing, and survived long enough to see victory. But he never forgot that July evening outside Kursk. Never forgot the faces of the men he'd killed, or the face of the one he'd let live. He carried Friedrich's photograph through the rest of the war, wrapped in waterproof paper, tucked inside his uniform. His good luck charm, the other soldiers joked. His burden, Dimitri knew. After the war, he returned to his village in the Urals. His mother had died during the siege of Leningrad, evacuated too late. His father had been killed in the factory where he'd worked, crushed by machinery during a German air raid. But Katya had survived, grown into a young woman who cried when she saw him at the door. "You came back," she whispered, holding him tight. "You kept your promise." Dimitri said nothing. He'd kept the promise to his sister, yes. But he'd broken so many other promises along the way. Promises to comrades who died. Promises to himself about what kind of man he'd be. Promises that seemed naive now in the face of what war had made him do. He worked the collective farm, married a widow from the next village, had 2 children. He rarely spoke about the war except on Victory Day, when he'd put on his medals and march with the other veterans, accepting the toasts and the glory that he never quite felt he'd earned. At night, sometimes, he'd dream of wheat fields and the smell of cordite, of blue eyes going dark, and brothers crying over brothers. He'd wake in a cold sweat, and his wife would hold him without asking questions. The photograph stayed in a drawer, hidden away with his medals and his discharge papers. He never showed it to anyone. Years later, decades later, an envelope arrived from West Germany. The letter inside was written in careful Russian by someone who'd learned the language but never quite mastered it. "My name is Klaus Richter. I do not know if this letter will reach you or if you are still alive. I do not know if you will remember me. We met only once, in a wheat field outside Kursk, in July 1943. You were a Soviet soldier. I was Wehrmacht. We tried to kill each other. My brother Friedrich died that day. You had every reason to kill me too. I was unarmed, but I was still the enemy. But you let me walk away. I have spent 40 years trying to understand why. I wanted you to know that I made it home. I survived the war. I married, had children, built a life. None of that would have been possible without your mercy that day. I also wanted you to know that I think of Friedrich every day. I think of you too. I hope you survived as well. I hope you found peace, though I suspect neither of us truly did. There is no way to repay what you gave me that day. But I wanted you to know that it mattered, that your choice to let me live was not meaningless. I do not ask for your forgiveness. What we did to each other, to your country, cannot be forgiven with words. But I wanted to thank you for seeing me as a man, not just an enemy, for choosing mercy when hatred would have been easier. I hope this letter finds you well. Klaus Richter. Dmitri read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking worse than they had in years. Then he went to the drawer, pulled out the old photograph of 2 brothers in Wehrmacht uniforms, and looked at it for a long time. Klaus Richter. The brother who'd lived, who'd gone home, who'd built a life from the ashes of that terrible war. Dmitri picked up a pen and began to write back. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Klaus Richter. I remember. I have never forgotten. You ask why I let you live. I have asked myself the same question for 40 years. I think the answer is simple and complicated at the same time. I was tired. Tired of killing. Tired of death. Tired of being the instrument of someone else's hatred. When you stood up and put down your rifle, you gave me a choice. You reminded me that I was still human, still capable of choosing mercy over murder. In a war that took everything else from us, that choice was the last piece of my soul I had left. I don't know if I made the right decision. I only know it was the decision I could live with. I also survived the war. I also married and had children. On quiet days, I wonder if they exist because I let you live, because that one act of mercy somehow earned me the right to survive when so many better men didn't. I don't have answers, only questions and memories, and the weight of what we did. But I want you to know something. I don't regret letting you walk away. If I could go back to that wheat field, knowing everything I know now, I would make the same choice. Not because I was noble or good, but because in that moment, choosing mercy meant I was still human. And in a war designed to turn us all into monsters, being human was the greatest act of resistance. May you find peace, Klaus Richter. You and I, we carry our dead together. That is our burden and our bond. Dmitri Volkov. He sealed the letter and sent it. He never received a response. Klaus Richter died 6 months later of a heart attack, though Dmitri wouldn't learn this until years afterward. But somehow, writing those words lifted something from Dmitri's chest. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not absolution, just understanding. The war had tried to make them monsters. For a few moments in a wheat field, they'd refused. That had to count for something. Dmitri Volkov died in 1987, 2 years before the Berlin Wall fell. He was 75 years old, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His last words were in German, words he'd heard 44 years earlier. Mein Bruder, my brother. His family didn't understand. But perhaps he wasn't talking to them. At his funeral, they buried him with his medals, his photograph of Katya from before the war, and tucked in his uniform pocket a worn photograph of 2 German brothers in Wehrmacht uniforms, smiling at a camera in a world that no longer existed. 2 men who'd tried to kill each other. 2 men who'd chosen mercy instead. 2 men bound together by the worst and best of what humans can do to one another. The story of the lone Soviet soldier who survived with nothing but a knife and a grenade became something of a legend in his village. Old veterans would tell it at Victory Day celebrations, each retelling adding a little more drama, a little more glory. But they never knew the full story. Never knew about Klaus Richter, or the letter, or the choice Dmitri had made in that wheat field. Some stories are too complicated for legends, too human, too real. They exist in the space between hero and monster, between victory and survival, between the war we fought and the peace we tried to build afterward. Dmitri Volkov's story lives there, still a reminder that even in the darkest moments of humanity's darkest century, we still have choices. We can still choose mercy. We can still choose to see the enemy as human. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those choices let us keep our souls intact, even if they haunt us forever.